In January 1999, a strange alliance was forged in the city of Bonn in West Germany, when local side Bonner SC completed one of the strangest transfer swoops in football history. They signed the entire national team from a country nearly 5,000 miles away, Cuba. This is the story of FC Fidel, the 15 Cuban international players who travelled across the Atlantic to play for a struggling side in Germany's fourth tier because... reasons. Context! Cuban football for most of the 20th century was, well, to put it mildly, off the global radar. In fact, it was even off most Cubans' radars. When Fidel Castro swept to power in 1959, sport in Cuba went from a pastime for the elites to pastime for the people. Castro, a lifelong sports nut, believed athletic glory could help serve the revolution's ideological goals. In 1961, his new government created the Instituto Nacional de... well, yeah, you can read that. Or National Institute of Sports, Physical Education and Recreation for those who don't understand my botched Spanish. Abolishing private sports enterprises and sticking them in the bin. The idea was simple: sports for all. A nation of amateur athletes bringing glory to Cuba. As Castro would say, amateurism as we conceive of it is sport as a public right, a healthy activity free of mercantilism, with opportunities for the recreation and well-being of the entire population. Castro would have loved the last video I did on amateurism. Attempting to use sports as a proxy against those pesky capitalist pigs, thousands of state-funded sports facilities were built, and talent scouts combed the population for promising youngsters to funnel into academies. Castro's shake-up was great for sports like the alliteration-friendly trio of boxing, baseball and basketball, all of which Fidel was a big fan of, as well as the real-life version, rather than Konami version, of track and field, as the communist regime aimed to show up its bigger neighbour the USA at the Olympic Games, and win some international kudos points on a global stage. What this wasn't good for, however, was the neglected stepchild of football. Despite the global popularity of the beautiful game, in Cuba it remained firmly in the shadow of other sports. The country had qualified for the 1938 World Cup, albeit by default, where they surprisingly knocked out Romania in the round of 16, before getting not so surprisingly booted out 8-0 by Sweden in the quarter-finals. Post-Castro's revolution, Cuban football trudged along as a second-tier sport, with limited resources and attention, receiving about as much love as that cactus that's been sitting in my hallway the past year. I must remember to water that thing. Players received essentially no salary outside of the state-sponsored training and living expenses, so any Cuban footballer dreaming of fame and fortune had two choices: defect abroad and be branded a traitor, or just accept amateurism until Fidel had a change of heart. Or was assassinated, which in the 1960s didn't seem too unlikely given how obsessed the CIA were with the idea. Despite constraints, Cuba's footballers did have occasional moments to shine. In 1969, the Cuban FA appointed North Korean coach Kim Yong-ha to lead the national team. In a true sign of socialist solidarity, the team went off on a 6-month training camp, a short 7,500 miles away in North Korea. For most of the squad, it was the first time they'd left Cuba, and visiting North Korea of all places for your first ever hollybobs was certainly a choice. The cultural and language barrier alone would have been tough enough for Cuba's national side. But then the coaching staff decided to mix things up even more, by taking the team on a tour of friendlies in the very much still at war Vietnam. Despite the homesickness, mental breakdowns, and occasional match postponed by the sound of B-52s, Kim Yong-ha's magical communist tour actually worked. The lads came back a different side. The Cuban national team won gold in the Central American and Caribbean Games of 1970, before following it up with a bronze medal at the 1971 Pan American Games, and an impressive 4th place at the 1971 CONCACAF Championship. However, the 70s would pretty much be the high point for Cuban football. The country would make it to the quarterfinals of the 1980s Olympic Games in the USSR, though many countries were boycotting the event due to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. For the most part, the 80s weren't exactly an exciting time to be a Cuban football fan, and the start of the 90s were even worse. Cuba's sporting infrastructure came with a caveat. They were achieved under a tightly controlled system propped up by Soviet aid and a relatively sheltered economy. That would come to an abrupt halt in 1991, when the collapse of the Soviet Union sent Cuba into a deep economic crisis. Cuba's Communist Party dubbed this era the Special Period in Peacetime, which is like calling Titanic sinking a sightseeing cruise of the bottom of the Atlantic. In reality, the Special Period was a time of severe austerity. Fuel imports dried up, industry stalled, food became scarce, and the socialist economy had to improvise. Despite this, Cuba was still able to remain competitive on the sporting international stage, continuing its baseballing dominance and even bringing a record 31 Olympic medals home for the country in 1992 and an impressive 25 medals at Atlanta 1996. Cuba's national football team, on the other hand, continued their unremarkableness. After withdrawing from qualification for the 1994 World Cup due to social unrest in the country, Cuba followed it up by failing to qualify for the 1996 CONCACAF Gold Cup and finished bottom of their qualification group for the World Cup 1998. By the beginning of 1999, Cuba had dropped to 110th in the FIFA World Rankings. Regardless of the fact Cuba were a bit pants, football's popularity was quietly growing on the island. The success of their neighbours to the south, Jamaica, who reached the 1998 World Cup, had Cuban sports authorities dreaming of their own World Cup breakthrough. However, their rigid policy of banning any player who defected to play professionally abroad meant Cuba had to improve using only local talent that had little to no exposure of football outside of the island. Cuban officials were desperate for a way to develop their national squad, but how could they do it without breaking their own amateur ethos? Well, the answer would come from an unlikely source. Bonn Sports Club, based in the former West German capital of Bonn, was a club with an illustrious past. Oh, hang on a minute. An unillustrious past. Since the modern iteration of the club was erected in 1965, Bonn had spent most of its existence flip-flopping between the 3rd and 4th tiers of Germany's footballing pyramid, with the height of their success coming in the late 60s and 70s, where they popped up in the 2nd tier. While they hadn't won any major trophies, the club could at least be proud of making it into the record books in 1977, by becoming the first ever German club to lose its license due to financial irregularities. Oh, hang on a minute, that's not a good thing. By late 1998, Bonner SC was languishing in Oberliga Nordrhein, fighting to avoid the drop through the metaphorical foul tour into Germany's 5th tier. With the club flaccidly limping into the winter break, Bonner Sports Club was in need of support. Enter Bonner SC's owner, an entrepreneur named Hans Robert Fiol. With more traditional recruitment methods failing, and club morale low, Mr. Fiol needed to think outside the box. And outside the box he did. Think. A seed of an idea was planted in 1998 when Hans Robert Fiol says he stumbled upon a videotape of a match between Cuba and Brazil. Side note, I couldn't find any evidence of a Brazil versus Cuba match taking place in 1998. So to illustrate the point, here's Taka Michinoku versus Triple H for the WWF Championship from April 2000. Despite a 2-0 loss in this phantom game to Brazil, Hans was struck by the surprisingly valiant display the Cuban national team put up. Cuba's spirited performance against such strong opposition made Hans wonder, if these Cuban players could hold their own against the mighty Brazil, imagine what a few of them might do in Germany's fourth tier. Sensing an opportunity, Hans picked up the phone, or more likely the fax machine, international calls weren't cheap in 1998, and contacted the Cuban Football Association. His initial pitch was for Bonn SC to sign one or two of Cuba's top players, such as Lazaro Detour and Manuel Bobadilla. Hans waited eagerly for a response. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Cuban officials were no doubt stood around scratching their collective heads after reading this strange transfer request. And, to their credit, they actually gave it some consideration. On one hand, this was exactly the kind of international exposure they wanted for their players. On the other hand, splitting up the national team wasn't ideal. So the Cubans countered with an even stranger proposal. What if you just take them all? The whole national team, a package deal. What sounded like a bit of a take was a genuine offer from the Cuban FA, perhaps inspired by the spirit of the Cuban national side's journey to North Korea 30 years earlier. They wanted to keep the gang together. For Hans Robert Viol and Bonn SC, it was all or nothing. Viol was completely unbothered by the prospect of integrating 15 non-native untested players into his floundering club and agreed to the whole thing. Fidel Castro himself reportedly gave his personal blessing to the deal, and thus, the unlikeliest of transfer deals was hatched. In January 1999, Bonn Sports Club had effectively signed the entire Cuban national squad. For those not familiar with the German transfer system of the 1990s, this is what people in the industry would call a bit funky. But most importantly, legal, as it was structured more like a loan deal. The Cuban FA retained all the players' registrations with their local Cuban clubs, and since Bonn Sports Club played below the top two divisions, German rules about foreign player limits didn't apply. Everything was above boards, at least from a technical perspective, for Cuba to export an entire team to the German Oberliga. And it wasn't just the players either. They got the whole shebang, including coaches, support staff, everyone but the half-time Orangeman. In total, Bonn had signed 15 Cuban players, Cuba's head coach and assistant, a cook, a physio, and an interpreter, as presumably very few from the Cuban contingent could give the correct answer to Sprechen Sie Deutsch. The Cuban excursion to Bonn was meant to last about 18 months, carrying the team through to the end of the 1999-2000 season, with an option to extend if things suited both parties. Bonner's sporting director, Gerd de Maan, said in an interview, "We are confident that this decision will be a game-changer for football in Bonn," while the official newspaper for the Communist Party back in Cuba, Granma, wrote, "The explosiveness of the Caribbean footballer and his speed were virtues that surely caught the eye of Bonn officials." It's not entirely clear if the author had ever watched Cuba play a football match or not. Of course, this being Castro's Cuba, a few conditions applied. The regime was fine with sending players abroad, but only as amateurs. Under no circumstances could they become pampered professionals. The Cubans would basically play for free, with Bonn SC only giving them a little pocket money, as well as agreeing to cover housing, food, transport, and novelty lederhosen come Oktoberfest. Unsurprisingly, this more than suited Hans Robert Viol and his German club. The whole thing reportedly cost Bonn Sports Club about $500,000, or £350,000 in today's future money. A bargain for a national team, if you ask me. The logistics around the operation were, creative. The Cubans would live together in an old youth hostel on the edge of a forest outside of Bonn, away from the city, any distractions, and conveniently any public transport, just in case any of Cuba's more talented players got any ideas of defecting into their heads. Ultimately, this was a two-way street. Cuba had the lofty ambitions of qualification for the 2002 World Cup, so competing against a different caliber of side was important to the Cuban officials. Bonner also agreed to organise friendly matches so Cuba could test themselves against a variety of opposition, including the European powerhouses of Liechtenstein and Luxembourg, as well as youth teams from Belgium, Germany and the Netherlands. The Bonner brass also arranged for the Cubans to attend a number of Bundesliga matches. You see, there wasn't much football on Cuban television outside of what they could piggyback off from American broadcasts. So, watching a full 90-minute top-flight match would have been a real eye-opener for the Cuban players. However, the prospect of this Cuban invasion was ruffling some feathers. The German media had a field day with this cultural exchange, nicknaming Bonner FC Fidel. Other clubs and officials at the German Football Association were generally uneasy about the whole thing. Was it fair? Was it a gimmick? Was it a plot to spread communism throughout lower league regional German football? Even Bonner's own players were sceptical. Defender Norman Persson said, "If you play in our reserve team, then in Cuba you'd probably be an international." While club captain Gregor Ibil said, "At first I really thought it was an April Fool's joke. Since it's December I have to believe it, but I'm still having trouble imagining how it's going to happen," before adding that many of Hans-Robert Fiol's previous ideas had burst like soap bubbles. And burst it nearly did, straight off the bat. Visa kerfuffles delayed the Cubans' arrival by months, meaning that rather than arriving in January 31st as expected, Bonner would have to wait until the spring for their Caribbean reinforcements to arrive. I'm starting to wonder whether this was worth the hassle, you know. And so, on April 7th, 1999, the Cuban cavalry touched down in Deutschland, swapping sun-drenched Havana for not-so-sun-drenched Rheinbach, the town outside of Bonn where their team accommodation awaited. The arrival of the Cuban reinforcements was a big bonus for Hans-Robert Fiol's club. While they were sitting just above the relegation zone, their form hadn't exactly been electric, and with injuries mounting up, the boys from the Caribbean might be called upon earlier than anticipated. For Bonner's head coach, Rainer Thomas, the solution was simple: German defence, Cuban attack. 4 Cubans made their debut in a 1-1 draw against Langeverhe less than a week after they arrived, with Cuba's Yomber Aguado scoring Bonner's only goal. 7 Cuban players made appearances against relegation rivals Germania Teveren, in a match that ended 2-2. The Cubans' instant impact for Bonner SC no doubt delighted their head coach, who told Die Welt, "The timing couldn't have been better." Probably more relieved rather than anything that his club hadn't just signed a bunch of duds. The Cubans followed their league performances with an impressive outing in a 3-2 friendly loss against Bundesliga side Borussia Mönchengladbach. In a remarkable turnaround, Bonn was getting swept up in Cuban fever. In an interview with Die Welt, Rainer Thomas said, "At first, there were only 3 public appearances. Last week the guys were inundated with invitations. On Sunday, the salsa disco even opened especially for them." Little did they know the salsa disco would mark the beginning of the end for this cultural exchange. After a month in Bonn, the Cubans hopped on a plane back home to take part in the Caribbean Cup, with the promise that they'll be back in the Rhineland in July to take part in Bonn's pre-season. Spoilers, they didn't. Despite the Cuban players jetting back to the Caribbean, Bonner Sports Club survived the month of May and avoided the drop by a single point, with the result they'd managed against Langeverhe proving to be the difference maker. Cuba meanwhile put their German training to use in the Caribbean Cup, making it to the final, knocking out Jamaica along the way, only to lose to Trinidad and Tobago 2-1 in the final, courtesy of a golden goal in extra time. As summer 1999 rolled around, the footballing inhabitants of Bonn eagerly awaited the return of the Cuban national team for pre-season training. But there was a tiny problem. FIFA and the German Football Association were sticking their noses into the deal. Fears of competitive distortion had been swelling, as well as concerns of whether Cubans were being exploited. FIFA spokesman Andreas Herrens said at the time, "FIFA cannot prohibit it. But it has been determined that the action is undesirable and does not conform to good practice, which is shorthand for it's technically legal but stop f***ing around. German authorities started getting counterfuso about the whole situation, and in August 1999, the final blow came. In an act of totally uncool bureaucratic buzzkill, the long-standing Cologne district president, Franz Josef Antwerps, suddenly withdrew the national team's visas, meaning the transfer deal was dead in the water. Only 4 Cuban players would make the return trip. The rest of the national team remained in Cuba, effectively putting an end to the FC Fidel experiment before it ever really got running. Bonn Sports Club shriveled without the supplemental Cubans. The 99-2000 season was downright rubbish for them. They finished second from bottom in the league and were binned off from the Oberliga Nordrhein. With the season finished, only Vladimir Alejo and Yomba Aguedo remained in Europe after meeting their future wives during their time in Bonn. The other 2 Cubans returned to their home country, which was having its own footballing-related problems. The goal of this wild plan, remember, was to help Cuba reach the 2002 World Cup, but they wouldn't get anywhere near it. In May 2000, just a year after the Bonn adventure, Cuba crashed out of World Cup qualifying in a humiliating loss to Barbados on penalties. They must have forgotten the shootout module as part of the German training course. On the face of it, the Cuban crossover with Bonn Sports Club was a big fat bust. Cuba hadn't got any closer to the World Cup, and Bonn were falling through the trapdoor of German footballing obscurity. So it was all for nothing, right? Well, not entirely. What both sides lost in actual footballing success, they gained in friendship, or something sentimental like that. The Bonn-Cuba connection remained strong for years to come. In 2008, Hans-Robert Fiol stepped in to assist Cuba with their search with a new national team coach, and arranged for former Hannover and Eintracht Frankfurt coach Reinhold Fans to become their new manager. With the ambition of qualification to World Cup 2010, Reinhold Fans' first act was to organise a training camp for his Cuban side, in Germany of course. Unfortunately, Reinhold's reign wasn't fantastic. Cuba finished bottom of their qualification group. Around the same time, things would be going even worse in West Germany. In 2010, Hans-Robert Fiol's club was an absolute scheisse show. Bonner SC were €7 million in debt, and no amount of outside-of-the-box thinking would get the club out of this one. Just like Michael Scott, the club declared bankruptcy in July 2010, and while it was able to survive, Bonner was banished to the 7th tier of German football. Cuba hasn't gotten any closer to World Cup qualification, but things on the island are changing. Football's popularity continues to grow, particularly among young Cubans as broadcasts of matches become more widely available, as well as investment in grassroots. And it probably hasn't hurt that the Cuban government, since the 2010s, has eased its restrictions on athletes playing abroad. Many footballers are now allowed to sign professional contracts overseas without defecting, so long as the Cuban government gets a part of that juicy payday in taxes. This means that Cuban footballers can now play for their national team and gain valuable experience across the globe, without having to spend 4 weeks in a German youth hostel. The Bonner-Cuban experiment didn't usher in a golden age of football in Bonn, nor did it revolutionise Cuban football, and the only lasting insight was discovering that shoehorning an entire national team into a lower division football club is not, in fact, the key to shooting up the footballing pyramid. Hans-Robert Fiol approached this with all the energy of a challenge-obsessed football manager streamer, and I admire that. The project may have been a failure, but at least it failed with flair. And while the club are no closer to the Bundesliga than they were in 1999, they are at least back in the 4th tier of German football. Back where they started, but with a friend or two made along the way, and the lingering legacy of a few Bonner Sports Club shirts hidden away in the back of wardrobes somewhere in Havana.